Hi, I'm Dr. Yeliz Esaryal, and I want to talk to you today about interview analysis, specifically content analysis of the interviews. So, why are we doing qualitative text analysis? So, remember that with your analysis, you're not trying to just check a task off, you're trying to answer a research question, specifically a qualitative research question. And the reason why you're doing that is perhaps you don't have sufficient models from the literature to answer fully your research question. Therefore, you have a more open-ended research question that you want to gather information from what the interviewee said. And you're basically trying to have a grounded approach to data analysis. You are grounding your theory on the data. So you would have some sample questions that are open, such as what are the research patterns, what are the patterns of interaction between change agents and recipients in successful projects. So your question is a what question instead of is there a relationship between A and B? In that case, A and B are known and you should use survey analysis instead of qualitative text analysis. How to analyze the texts. Basically, you need to read the text, you need to catch different signals and then label them. Then you look at those labels, what you labeled, which we also call memoing, and you need to combine them and summarize different patterns. So you start from a whole text, then you have some memos, some labels, potential labels. Then you look over those labels when you finish analyzing all of your text, and then you see patterns, and then you categorize them even further. So this process is called coding or content analysis. To do coding or content analysis, you need to first establish a unit of analysis. It could be at the sentence level, word level, group of words, paragraph level, or question-answer pairs. You could also just pick up a meaningful answer, which might actually change between. It could be a sentence, it could be a sentence, a few sentences. Then you assign codes to the text. So a code is a label observation where a meaning can be given to a piece of information. So your answers to your questions could be closed or semi-closed or open. So for example, if you ask about how did you inform the employees about a specific change project, if they have told you answers such as emails, newsletters, face-to-face communications, you can actually code them. You can actually count them and then provide a count at the end for each interviewee. Of course, this is somewhat useful, but given in cases where you have fewer interviewees, such as 3 or 4, then you try to get more often some open, in-depth answers where you can actually categorize, assign codes and then categorize them. So the fact that you actually put some quantification, some numbers, does not mean that it becomes quantitative research. So here's an example. How would you characterize your style of leadership in this change? Could you give an example of this? And when you ask this, one agent said, very involving, I think. And another one said, I like to make sure to incorporate everyone's ideas into my decisions. So I would recommend that you can highlight these first, and then you can put little memos saying, first one is saying involving, and the other one is incorporating ideas. And then you look at these, and it doesn't make sense to keep them as separate labels, because then you have 100 separate labels and it doesn't help you theorize. So then you look at these and you say, oh, involving, and incorporating people's ideas. So you can actually say evolving or collaborative as a main code, and then these would be the codes, the two different codes that are same code assigned to two different texts. Okay, so here is another example, an extended example. So we've asked the same question: how would you characterize your style of leadership in this change? Could you give an example of this? So we have agent, we have recipient 1 and recipient 2 giving answers to the same questions. And when you assign the codes, you can actually find out, okay, the agent thinks that he or she is very involving, but the recipient 1 and 2, they are similar in that they think, okay, she's not really involving us, but she's providing one-way communication. And also we see something else emerging as one of the recipients saying she's an initiative taker. So then that gives you even more rich data, because you see then there is a gap between the perception of the agent and the recipients. Once you have these codes, you can take a look at another look at your codes, and then you can order them and group them into categories. Once you have the categories, you can then analyze relationship between categories. Again, you can look at commonalities between recipients, a contrast of answers of recipients. You can compare and contrast what agents and recipients said. Throughout, you can take memos. So memos, I mentioned memos earlier. Memos could be like some sample codes that you assign to texts by saying, oh, this could be a potential code, but I don't know for sure now, so I'll just put it as a memo. You could also write memos on your feelings or your reaction to the text as you're reading it. So you can say, oh, she looks to be here a little too self-absorbed, or she's nervous about things, or whatever you've observed. You know, you can say, you can even put your own conflict, saying, I want to code this with code A, but I think it's also close to code B. Shall I combine them, or shall I keep separate codes? So all of your notes will be helpful, because when you come back to this research again to answer your research questions, etc., then you might forget what you have thought about when you're doing the analyses. Or if you're doing the analysis in groups, then people who are coding might be different than people who are writing different parts of the paper. So then again, memos would be useful to exchange knowledge between different people. Okay, so here's an example of step 2 plus 3. Here we had a research question: did the change agent adapt his or her approach to change to accommodate the employees? So you see two different respondents giving two different answers, but you can see that the answers are categorized into two factors, so two categories: solution change and process change. So if further analysis, we've figured out, okay, in some cases the agent adapted his approach, but he adapted by changing the whole solution. Okay, so for example, one person said, we had a major problem, I thought I had a solution, but it did not work. I applied my boss's solution then. So there's a solution change. But there's also a second group of factors that we called process change. So for example, the agent either changed communication methods, or he changed the process of how ideas should be created. Again, these come up based on your first coding, and then categorize your codes into different categories or factors. Here's another example of completely different topic. And remember, during the interview session, I've talked about interviewing, and I've showed you some videos of interviewing about different sodas. So we already knew here in the model in the middle you say taste, you see taste and packaging, and that's because taste and packaging actually came from the literature as being important to the quality of soft drinks. So so in research questions, in the interview questions, you can actually ask about them because these come from the literature. You can say, could you tell me to what extent is taste important to you in determining the quality of a soft drink? Same thing for packaging. Do you prefer plastic or glass bottles? And is it important to you that something is in plastic or a glass bottle? Then you could actually find out yes or no, direct relationships with interviewing method. But there could be also other factors that you want to determine whether there are other factors and they have influence on the quality of soft drinks. Then you could ask a question that's more open-ended, saying, could you explain which of these soda cans you prefer and why? And then with your coding, you will come up with completely new unknown factors. For example, in this case, we have identified healthiness and green attitude as being new factors, but also we knew that the shape, from before, from the theory, we knew that the packaging was important, but we also realized that the shape has people think of shape in terms of some categories. For example, does it have a modern look, or is it similar to some other brands? So you can even learn about some of the factors that come from the literature. You can learn something new about them, something more detailed about them. Okay, so what could your research model be like? So what you do is you determine, you can do this, you can have this approach where you're looking at some factors that you gather from the protocols we gave you. You can get, you can also look at some factors from the literature review, and you can gather some factors from the inductive analysis. So there are, depending on where your beginning point is, for example, if your beginning point is from the literature, then you have a top-down deductive coding approach. Whereas if your beginning point is not the literature and you're trying to get your theory strictly from the data, then you would have a bottom-up coding approach. When would you use one or the other? That depends on what's in the literature. So you should always look at the literature. And if you already find some things from the literature, like the soda example, and like the soft drink example, if you already have stuff in the literature, you should definitely use it. So then you would have some codes that are top down. But then if you're expecting, based on the literature, that there are more factors that are not listed clearly in the literature, then for those factors you have a bottom-up approach. So you can actually mix a top-down and a bottom-up approach. You can have a top-down approach, everything coming from the literature, and you can have a complete bottom-up literature, bottom-up approach, and that happens when you don't have anything in the literature, which happens somewhat rarely, and so be careful about that. Here we have an example. For example, we have the change style of the agent influencing behavior change in individuals. But we also, for example, know that communication and interaction between the agent and the recipients is important. And then you can actually, if you look at your protocols, you can use factors such as consulting for inputs, visioning, communication of important matters. You could have factors such as project success, behavior change in individuals, or employee openness to change. These are also very important independent variables to look at. So these are to give you some ideas as to what factors you could include in your research. Why and how should you develop a coding schema? So coding schema is a summary of all the codes you have used, and it provides explanations and examples and sources. Why should you use one? Well, first of all, it creates dependability. So when somebody is reading your research, they can rely on, okay, this is a properly done analysis. It allows the reader to follow your own process as to analysis of the data. It also causes repeatability. The idea is that someone else should be able to pick up your coding schema, and by reading it very carefully, they should be able to take your data and analyze it exactly as you have and come up with very similar, if not exactly the same, conclusions based on your coding schema. You should always report your coding schema and your schema development in your methods section of your paper, so you should describe this. You should include a schema in the appendix or the body of the of your text, and you should include the coded text in the appendix. So you can actually normally when you have a lot of data to analyze, you can use something like Atlas TI software to analyze your code. But in this case, it's sufficient that you use Word and you use your Word's commenting function to code your text. So we want to see how you have coded your text. You should make tables of your codes to present your data and make a nice story. So okay, here's when I say make a nice story, is what is the story that your data tells you? You're telling that story, the story of your data. Here are examples of coding schemas. The first one is a deductive one. You see the sub-steps are the codes, basically. This is from a decision-making paper that I have written. And decision phases are categories that categorize multiple sub-steps. So, for example, identification decision phase has 2 sub-steps, and each sub-step has a description. And each one has literature mentioned next to it, so that the interested reader can go to the literature and check the sources. This is deductive coding schema from the literature. An inductive coding schema has a code name, code definition. What I also have here is related rules. What happens is when you're coding, you can actually code text with someone else. So each individual, two individuals can code independently, and then they can come back and discuss which code they picked for which text and why. And as you're discussing this, you're identifying some interesting things where you're saying, okay, should we put this in this code or that code? And then you start coming up with rules. So here I give some examples of the rules as to how to do the coding, so that somebody else who takes this coding schema can actually apply it in the same way as I did. And I also provide examples from the interviews themselves. Okay, so what is important in the end for coding? Having an interesting story. What is the storyline that you have found? And answering the research question in an interesting way. What is interesting? When I say interesting, that means it makes theoretical contributions to the literature, and it makes practical contributions. So, and in the discussion section, you need to actually discuss what is your contribution to the theory and what's your contribution to the practice. If you are finding some answers to your research question that you've already known even before doing the research, That's really a shame. That does not really add practical or theoretical contribution. That's why when you're coming up with your research questions at the beginning, you always think about what could be some of the potential answers that might come up. And is it worth doing this research? Okay, so then you pick the right questions. I hope you have picked the right questions before you came to the analysis section. And then when you analyze, you really find something new. When you find something new, you need to present this story in a way that it becomes alive. So you use tables for your closed-ended question, but you also use tables to show different quotes together, how they contribute to the theory. So I provided a sample paper in the final project section, so you could see exactly how I use specific quotes to tell a story, and how I use the tables and figures. So you use quotes to make sure that the story comes alive. So you pick quotes that are very interesting. So you don't use quotes where people said, "Yes, surely I did," or "Yes, interaction is important." That's very dull. That would go into your tables. But you use like really interesting, exciting quotes from the interviews. Then the reader reads it and gets excited and follows it in a more interested way. You also use tables because the reader wants to make sure whether what you showed them, in other words, the quote, is just one quote, or is it a representative sample of other quotes you've seen. So you use the tables to kind of convince the reader that you have really seen this phenomenon. So you would have one or two quotes about something, but then you would have a table showing all the quotes that you have found that helped you build the theory. So here's the sample table showing the quotes. What I was trying to show with this paper is individuals showed certain leadership, and this leadership created transformational impact on technology development. So this is the theory building of the paper. So what you see is I put responded numbers there, I put the quotes, but then I actually explain the quote. In my explanation, I'm actually linking how what the leader did influenced the outcome. So actually these quotes are about the arrows. So if you have individual behavior, the leadership of the individual, and the outcome being the technology development. So here I'm showing the link, the arrow, that she has done something, leader has done something, and that influenced the outcome. So you see that all of the quotes I picked for this one is showing the arrow, meaning how it connects two boxes. So one thing that I want to definitely highlight you is this issue of showing arrows versus the boxes. So if you code one box contents and the other box contents, you cannot show in your research that there's a relationship to it between the two. To give you an example, if I ask you about the linkage between the success of a change leader, change agent, and how they look. So if you make a category saying, okay, how they look, let's find out how they look. And then you see, okay, they're blonde, they're blue-eyed, they wear dark suits. And then on the other hand, you make quotes for the project is successful versus the project is unsuccessful, or the change agent is successful versus unsuccessful. You cannot link these two. You need to find specific quotes, like the ones I showed you in this slide, where you see a connection between the way agent looks and the fact that they're successful. You must almost see an interview quote that says, well, she's always wearing dark suits, and I think that makes her successful. So here you have a connection. You're now coding the arrow. You're not coding one of the other of the boxes. You cannot, because you see the factors here, such as being blonde, wearing dark clothes, you cannot see a relationship between these and the change agent's success, unless the quote specifically tells you the connection. Now, when I'm selecting a quote, a topic that's such silly as, the fact that the change agent is blonde and the fact that they're successful, there's no connection. So it immediately makes sense to you. But in your own projects, sometimes you guys make the mistake of saying, oh, here, we see all these factors, and we know that this person is successful, so these factors must be relevant to them. The answer is no, it's not relevant. It's only relevant when the interviewee clearly makes the relevance obvious to you. It happens in two ways. Either you asked a question about the connection. For example, if you had asked, what makes this change agent successful? And they mentioned, well, she's blonde, she wears dark clothes, and then these codes are relevant because you've asked a specific arrow question and you have received the answers that listed the factors. That's one way of catching the arrow. The other way of catching the arrow is when the interviewee mentions the arrow. And that happens when they say, I think she's a successful change agent because Then those factors are actually relevant to change agent success. So this is the end of my presentation on interview analysis. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, feel free to email them to me.